Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Conversational AI with Rasa series. In this video, we will talk about responses. Responses are simple messages that your assistant can send back to the user without running custom actions or returning any additional events. To define a response, you will have to create a response template, and while doing so is the simplest way to enable your assistant to respond to the users, there are quite a lot of configurations that you can use to make those responses more interesting and engaging. First, let's talk about the general setup. Response templates are defined inside of your domain.yaml file inside of the section called Responses. Here you can define as many response templates as you would like your assistant to be able to use. A response template has to come with a label that has to start with the prefix utter. It's a very important prefix because this is how your assistant will learn to distinguish response templates from other possible response types. The second part of the label corresponds to what the response is actually about. The last part of the response template is the actual response. It has to start with a prefix text, and after that you can define whatever message you would like your assistant to send back to the user when this specific response is predicted. To reiterate on what I have just said, I would like to show you an actual example of an assistant that has some response templates defined. Here I am using a very simple assistant that is a little bit enhanced moodbot assistant. As I have mentioned, responses are defined inside of your domain.yaml file under a specific section called Responses. And here I can define as many responses as I would like my assistant to be able to use when responding back to the users. Each response consists of a label with the prefix utter and the actual message that should be sent back to the user. Simple responses usually consist of a simple text message that an assistant sends back to the user when a corresponding response is predicted. Now let's have a look at how we can make those responses more interesting. The easiest way to make your assistant's responses more interesting and dynamic is creating multiple responses for specific templates. You can define more than one possible way of how an assistant would, for example, greet the user. And you can do that by defining a few possible messages that an assistant would send back to the user when utter greet will be predicted. Rasa, under the hood, will randomize which message to send back to the user when this specific response is predicted. This will make the interactions with your assistant more interesting and natural. To demonstrate, I will quickly go back to my example assistant. As you can see, I have only one possible way of how my assistant would respond to the user greeting. The message will always be, "Hey, how are you?" But I would like to make this a little bit more dynamic. So I will include a few additional possible ways of how my assistant could greet the user. So I will add another text message for this specific template. And this one will be simple, "Hello there." I will add another one. Which will be quite similar, but it will be, "Hi, how can I help?" To make sure that my assistant picks up these changes, I will retrain my Rasa model using the command Rasa train. Once that's done, I would like to demonstrate how an assistant will randomize when picking the response back to the user. So I will load my assistant using Rasa shell. I would like to show you a few examples of how an assistant will randomize of which response message to use when responding back to the user. So very quickly, I will start a conversation with the message "Hello." And here you can see that an assistant responded with, "Hey, how are you?" I will restart the conversation and do the same. "Hello." The same. And now you can see that an assistant responded with a bit different one. Hi, how can I help? So as you can see, if you defined a few possible responses of how an assistant could respond to user messages, an assistant will make those choices for specific messages a bit more randomly. The next step for making your assistant's responses a little bit more interesting and dynamic is including variables in your assistant's response templates. If your assistant sets slots throughout the conversation, you can reference those slots in your assistant's response templates by simply including the slot name surrounded by the curly brackets. By doing so, you will enable your assistant to fill in these slot placeholders with the actual value of a slot at a specific time of the conversation. This will make the responses more interesting and definitely more dynamic. So for example, if your assistant extracts the user's name and sets it as a slot, by including the slot name inside of your response templates, you can enable your assistant to use the extracted username when responding back to the user. What happens when the reference slot hasn't been set? Rasa Assistant will fill in this slot placeholder with the empty value none. I would like to show you how all of this works in practice. Inside of my domain.yaml file, I added a few additional details. I created an entity called name, and this entity will be used to extract the user's name when the name is provided. If I quickly go to my nlu.yaml file, you will see that I also added a few examples where the user provides their name, and it is extracted as an entity. Back to domain.yaml file. I also defined a slot name with a type any that will be used to store the user's name. Now, since we have the slot defined, we can include it in our responses to enable our assistant to use this detail, user's name, when responding back to the user. To do that, I will include the slot name, and this will be surrounded by curly brackets. This means that when the username is extracted and the slot name is set, our assistant will use the current slot value to fill in this slot placeholder. I will add the slot to other response messages so that it's easier for us to test. I will save the changes and retrain the model for the changes to be picked up. I will load the assistant with Rasa shell. And I will test it. So I will say, hello, my name is Juste. So as you can see, my assistant responded, hi Juste, how can I help? So what happened is, assistant extracted my name Juste, set it as a slot, and we used it in a response because it filled in this slot placeholder with the actual slot value. Now let's test it another time. And this time I will not provide the name. So I will say, hello. As you can see, my assistant responded with hi, none, how can I help? What happened was the slot name hasn't been set, and that's why an assistant responded with the empty slot value. Rasa comes with a bunch of features that allows you to make your assistant's responses not only more interesting and dynamic, but more visual as well. So for example, you can include images inside of your assistant's response templates. To do that, you have to include additional detail, image, inside of your assistant's response template and reference the URL of where the image that you would like your assistant to use is hosted. Now, how the images show up will highly depend on your assistant's front end. The images in your command line will be shown as URLs, and the user will have to navigate to that URL. If you're using some kind of interface, for example, the one that you would find in Rasa X, the images will show up rendered inside of the chat. All right, so I would like to give you a very quick example of how to include images into your assistant's responses in practice. In my domain.yaml file, I actually have a proper example of that. So if you look at the response template utter cheer up, this is where an assistant would like to cheer up the user if they say that they are sad. An assistant would respond with a message, here, this is something to cheer you up, and would send an image of a cute tiger cub. So to do that, all I had to do is to create the response template, provide the message for the response, and include additional detailed image, and provide the URL of where the image is hosted. So I will have a quick conversation with my assistant to showcase how this image will show up in a command line. So I will say, hello, my name is Justa, and an assistant said, hey Justa, how are you? And I will say, I am sad. And then my assistant responded with, here is something to cheer you up, and included an image that an assistant wanted to show me. I would also like to show you a very quick demo of how images can be rendered in the actual conversation if you're using user interfaces like the one that is built in Rasa X. For that reason, I will launch my assistant in a local Rasa X mode. I will do that by running the command Rasa X. Rasa X comes with a feature, share your assistant with real testers. This feature allows you to share your assistant with real users and allow them to talk to your assistant while you are still working on developing your assistant. You can use the conversations and the feedback that you get from the testers to further develop your assistant. I will use the Rasa X inbuilt user interface to showcase you how images can be rendered inside of the conversation. So I will have a very quick conversation with my assistant. I will say hello. And my assistant responded with, hey, how are you? I will say that I am sad. And now my assistant responded with, here is something to cheer you up. And as you can see, the image that previously was displayed as a URL when we were testing an assistant in our command line, now is being rendered and displayed inside of the chat interface. Another way to make your assistant's responses more interesting and dynamic is by adding buttons. With buttons, your assistant can present a few possible options for the user to choose from. To enable your assistant to use buttons, you have to include a detailed buttons in your assistant's response templates and provide two important details for each button you implement. One of them is the title. The title represents the text that user will see on a button when the button is presented. And another detail is payload. A payload is the information that will be sent to the Rasa's backend when the user presses the button. In most cases, the payload will have to correspond to a specific intent that your assistant can understand, so that your Rasa assistant can take that information and do something with it without requiring an additional NLU layer to process that information. Buttons can also send entities as the payload to your Rasa assistant's backend. To do that, you simply have to reference the entities with their values inside of the assistant's response templates. The way buttons are presented to the user will highly depend on the user interface that you are using for your assistant. Some interfaces have a limited amount of buttons that they can show on the screen, and that's why you should always have a look at the documentation for a specific user interface that you would like to use for your assistant. I would like to show you a very quick demo of how to implement buttons with your assistant, and for that I will modify my utter greet response template. I will remove these two response messages and I will leave just the first one. So I would like to give the user two options when my assistant asks for how the user is feeling. So to do that, I will implement buttons. And to do that, I will define the key buttons and provide the details for two options that I discussed. So the first one will be the button for feeling great. So I will define the title for this button, which will be great. And again, this will be the text that the user will see when the button is displayed. Another important detail that we have to provide for this button is the payload. And payload is the information that will be sent to the assistant's backend when this specific button will be pressed. So to specify the intent that will be sent back to the assistant when the user presses the button, all I have to do is type the / and provide the name of the intent that will be sent to the assistant. And now very similar for the second button that will be displayed. Here the option will be bad, and the payload will be mood bad. Again, / and this is how your Rasa assistant will know that this is an intent that will be sent to your assistant's backend, and the name mood sad. I will save this change and I will retrain the model. And I will load the assistant using Rasa shell. Once the assistant is loaded, we can have a quick conversation, and I just want to show you how the buttons are displayed in our command line interface. So I will start the conversation with just simple hello. And here you can see the assistant responded with, hey, how are you? And we have two options, great or super sad, that I can choose using the arrow keys. If I choose great, then an assistant gets the intent mood great sent to the backend, and it predicts the next best action, which in this case is a response which says great, carry on. And now again, I would like to show you how buttons can be rendered in a user interface. And for this demonstration, I will once again use the Rasa X interface. After loading my assistant in the Rasa X, I will have a very quick conversation with my assistant. I will start with hello. My assistant responded with, hey, how are you? And gave me the two options, great or super sad. I will choose the option great. And my assistant responded with great, carry on. As you can see in the backend, my assistant received a message, mood great. This is the intent that was assigned as a payload to this button, great. My assistant then was able to use that information directly to predict the next best action, and additional NLU layer for this message wasn't necessary. You can also create a custom payload that will be sent to the output channel. So for example, you can create a date picker element and include it as a custom payload that will be sent to the assistant's front end. To do that, you have to define a custom key to define a custom payload. Inside of this key, you can define whatever payload you would like your assistant to send to the front end. Here again, the way custom payload will be displayed in a user interface will highly depend on what kind of front end you use for your assistant. So for example, some output channels might support the date picker element, but some of them may not. So you have to check the documentation to make sure that the custom payload you would like to display is supported by the output channel you would like to use. Another very important and useful configuration that you can include in your assistant is channel-specific responses. With this, you can enable your assistant to send specific responses to specific output channels, especially if you have more than one output channel that is connected to your assistant. Rasa supports quite a few output channels that you can use off the shelf. And to learn more about them, you should check out the Rasa's documentation. But for example, if you would like your assistant to send a specific message to Slack, you can do that by specifying the channel key inside of your response template and providing the name of the channel, which in this case would be Slack. Responses that are not specified under a specific output channel will be sent to all of the other output channels that your assistant is connected to. We spoke about all of the configurations that you can use when defining the response templates. The last thing that I wanted to cover is how to enable your assistant to use those response templates when responding to the user. All you have to do is include those response templates in your stories. And to do that, you have to reference the response template labels when writing the stories of how your assistant might handle some specific conversations. So for example, here, we have a very simple and short story, greet user. And there are only 2 steps. One of them is the user's intent when the user sends a greeting message to the assistant. And the response of an assistant is an action utter greet. And utter greet is the response template that is defined inside of your domain.yaml file. Response templates are a great way to enable your assistant to respond to your user messages without creating custom actions or returning additional events. I hope that after watching this video, you will play around with the configurations that we covered and that you will use this knowledge to create fun and engaging assistants.